Well, thank you to all of you that are here. Welcome. We're glad that you're here for our session on leveraging a data governance framework to appropriately use learning analytics. My name is Chad Shorter. I'm an evaluation and metric specialist here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. With me today are Dan Voeks and Kari Jordahl. Dan is our teaching and learning data steward, and Kari is our learning analytics program manager and works mostly with the culture change on campus for learning analytics. Unfortunately, Shannon, our colleague, is not able to be with us today. So in our session today, we're going to be talking about data governance and the teaching and learning data domain here at UW-Madison, as well as some of the cultural efforts taken to use teaching and learning data on our campus. And as we discuss, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions. We probably won't be able to respond. Somebody might respond in the chat, but we do have a planned pause about the midpoint and then time at the end for Q&A as well. So let's begin with a little bit of background information on kind of where we are at UW-Madison. And we'll start with our most recent step. Our most recent step is Data-Empowered Educational Practices, or DEEP. And you'll notice a nautical motif throughout some of these slides because we're navigating the deep waters of teaching and learning data. So we'll talk about DEEP. What it is a broad framework. It was established by our Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning. And learning analytics is part of this framework. Along with academic planning, student assessment, technologies, and more. It involves a consideration of like the whole student experience across the digital ecosystem as they interact with it at the university. And at the university, at UW-Madison, we have a rather broad definition for what we consider to be learning analytics. It's about actionable data. It's about improving student outcomes. It's about the learning environment. And the faculty group that studied and articulated this definition intentionally left it rather open so that it could include many stakeholders. So learning analytics involves students as much as instructors and also advisors and more. What you don't see in our definition here is any mention of a tool. We're taking a higher level view here about looking at learning analytics as a complex change process. It would be outstanding if everything lined up from the beginning. We could pick the perfect tool and hit the ground running because everyone's on board and life is full of puppies and go-karts and everything's perfect. But in reality, there are starts and stops and ebbs and flows and bursts and barriers. And we started exploring learning analytics, I guess it was about 10 years ago, with small grants to explore multiple technologies. So we tried out some of these tools, but I mean, we learned that the technologies weren't right for us at the time. We learned that the campus culture wasn't ready for learning analytics. As part of central IT, were not ready to scale anything at that point. And there simply wasn't any conception of what policy was going to be with the use of teaching and learning data. So it's taken us a lot of time and effort. It's almost always slower than we prefer, but we've set a foundation and we've built momentum now. I mentioned it was about 10 years ago that our first early experiments began. And then we realized quickly that we needed to have a strategic roadmap for our group and for this effort. We began engaging instructors in conversations and interviews and listening sessions and prototyping to figure out what they needed, or at least what they needed at the start. And in 2018, the teaching and learning data domain was established and a steward was appointed for the teaching and learning data. And that steward now is my colleague Dan, whom you'll hear from in just a second. We worked on defining learning analytics. We made change management plans. We're establishing guiding principles for the use of teaching and learning data, all while we're piloting and rolling out to campus the first instructor dashboard. And now we've created the first advisor dashboard, and we're meeting with students and interacting with them to see of all the many places we could start, what makes sense for our students now. And of course, all along the way on this journey, you have to keep an eye out for the Kraken. The Kraken isn't ever any one thing. It's all those little things that are hurdles to overcome, and there are always hiccups in any change management process. And we really just wanted to have a picture of a Kraken in our presentation. But one of the aspects that has really helped us navigate these waters has been the governance of teaching and learning data. And I will hand it off to my colleague, Dan, now to talk about it.
Thanks, Chad, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Again, my name is Dan Voeks. I am teaching and learning data steward and institutional policy analyst here at UW-Madison. I've been in this role relatively new, just started in 2020, right around the time the pandemic hit. And excited to talk to you today about data governance and its intersection with our learning analytics strategy. So let's go to the first slide, Kari. So I'll be speaking broadly about the concept of data governance overall and about our journey at UW-Madison and our maturation in that area. Talking about concepts and roles, and in particular about a new policy that we established at UW-Madison, went into effect last year. And again, the intersection of governance and learning analytics. For sort of a brief historical overview, data governance is not brand new to UW-Madison. In fact, it's existed for quite a long time in various forms and fashions. Historically, it has been highly decentralized, like almost everything at our campus, and especially where there had been pockets of governance or ways of doing governance, they weren't coordinated across domains, and often not in sort of a consistent fashion. Our move towards a more contemporary data governance paradigm and a more intentional model really began in earnest around 2014, and that came along with the establishment of our first institutional chief data officer. Early efforts as that moved forward included a big focus on culture building and awareness building. As our approach has further matured, we've moved in a more formal direction, building out governance bodies with data governance oversight, and formally appointing roles of data custodians or data stewards. Even our terminology has started to evolve. And as Chad mentioned, beginning in 2018, we first formally established a data domain that's dedicated to data within the teaching and learning space, our teaching and learning data domain. And further work has followed since then to build up and operationalize that. Next slide. So what is data governance at all? Just to kind of set some preliminary concepts. I think of it as intentionality about data. Every institution, higher ed or not, is always making decisions about data. Whether they've formalized a process for doing that or not. What data governance permits us to do is to be more strategic in the way that we're making decisions about our institutional data, and in particular to make strides to assure its appropriate use and its beneficial use. It also gives us a foundation to, frankly, to liberate data from silos where it's often been captured in IT systems and sort of opaque and not well known. Gives us a foundational piece to sort of open those doors and appropriately allow the data to flow to allow university business to move forward and to be innovative. Data governance, we think of it as centering on two core questions and giving us sort of the tools to work towards the answers to those questions. The first one is, what can we do with data? Just what's possible, what's legal, what's compliant with our policy, what's interesting, what do we know about the data? But also, what should we do with our data? What's ethical, what's strategic, what's beneficial, what's risky? A centerpiece of how we've incorporated data governance into the teaching and learning space is to approach those broad questions that are in a way that's informed by the subject matter area, and is closely engaged with and invested in the teaching and learning activities, and invested and engaged with student success. Organizationally, as a data steward, I'm located within our newly established Learning Analytics Center of Excellence, which is within our academic technology unit. And within our governance hierarchy, I'm accountable to our vice provost for teaching and learning. Myself, I have a professional background for many years in learning technology, working at UW-Madison in a variety of roles. Our key priorities, especially within the teaching and learning space where we are right now, are to promote equitable student access with the use of our data, and to advance general education. And really, we think that a flexible and a context-aware approach to data governance assures that we're able to calibrate our approach. Really, what we don't want to do is to use a hammer to force square pegs into round holes. But we're also situated in a broad, more or less standardized institutional data governance framework, and where there are standards that cut across that, but there are also different approaches that are suitable in different areas, whether we're talking about administrative data, curricular planning, facilities management, to be able to sort of take an approach that's suitable to each of those areas. Next slide. So at UW-Madison, our model of data governance is, it's been adapted from an industry standard framework developed by a consortium called DAMA, Data Management Association. And on the slide here, you'll see what we think of as some of the high-level features of data governance, strategy, policy, oversight and compliance, and so forth. But we don't think of any model, and certainly not the one that we've adapted, as a one-size-fits-all sort of drop-in approach. There's much work that's been involved in sort of tailoring the principles of this model and building it out in a way that's aligned with our own institutional structures and our own institutional culture. And I think one message that's important to send is that data governance should not be thought of as something that's just done by a particular person, a particular role, or even a certain groups of people or certain bodies. It's not just a policy or procedure, but it's really a whole organizational way of thinking and operating. It structures how we make decisions around our data, how we manage the organizational change to enable effective decision making. And optimally, we're working towards a destination where that's more or less infused and synchronized with just how we do business. It's going to be an ongoing, it's a perpetual, it's a life cycle. It's not tied to a specific event or an outcome. And really, there's no formula to make data governance happen. It's a fluid process, iterative and evolutionary. There are certainly pieces of our approach that emphasize due diligence, compliance, and protection of individual privacy. Certainly in the teaching and learning data area, for example, often we find there's gaps with vended third-party tools, looking at the gaps between their terms of service or privacy policies with our own obligations under FERPA. But mere compliance is really just a starting point. And as our institutional approach matures, we really think it's going to give us the tools for bringing in a broader range of considerations, including strategic ones, to inform our decision-making about data. Next slide. So as we've advanced in our journey, in September 2020, our institution adopted a comprehensive new institutional data policy. And this is really a foundational piece. It sets out in 12 high-level statements some concepts, roles, terms, and responsibilities. And it's very broad. It's not exhaustive, and it doesn't detail what compliance entails, but it does provide the starting point that we're able to build on. We've also had a phased approach to our implementation. The policy was formally announced in fall of 2020 and took effect first as of January 1st for 2021, only for new cases of data, new systems, new implementations, new use cases. And the following year, continuing the phased approach for existing systems and existing cases. We have sort of a nested structure, and as a policy at our campus, we really expect that at the policy level, this is something that's going to change very infrequently. There are certainly going to be specific applications that need more specific guidance, and as we get more tread on the tires of the policy, our governance our governance committee is building out formal standards and procedures to give more effect and specificity to the policy. And as well, it also preserves some flexibility for how the policies are applied and interpreted in individual domain areas. Really, the centerpiece of the policy on a conceptual level, I think there are two of them. One of them is our goal is to share data across campus to the greatest extent that is allowable under law and policy. And the second is that we do need to manage access to data in a way that's consistent with the requirements of the policy and our legal and regulatory obligations. Next slide. So one of the things the policy does is just define institutional data, and you can see the definition that we have up there on the slide. I'll give you a moment to look it over. I think really the takeaway is that it's exceptionally broad and inclusive. Notably, it's not limited to IT systems. We're not just talking about technology data, although certainly in the era that we live in and operate in, that's a major component of it. But it's data that is not limited to any particular medium, and there are lots of verbs about what it takes to meet that criteria. I won't go through them, but it's essentially anything that is produced in the process of, or it has a function in conducting university business, including our teaching and learning business. The one thing that's, I think, especially notable as well is that the area that is out of scope for our institutional data governance is research data, which is defined also there as data that is produced by research or data that's acquired in the process of conducting research. That doesn't mean that we don't have questions around how we manage the use of institutional data with research, and that's definitely an area where we're continuing to build out our institutional maturity and processes. But we already have separate governance roles and responsibilities and bodies that bear on research data, including our IRB. Next slide. So as part of our framework, our data governance council, which is the high-level strategic body that really provides guidance and strategy for implementation of the policy, has defined a number of high-level categories for our institutional data. And these are called data domains. And what we've got up here on the list is even just a snapshot in time. We're often there are often decisions being made to add to these or to sort of change how they're defined. But you can just sort of get a flavor from this that we're looking across the board at sort of institutional business. And what the domains are doing are helping us understand the lines of authority and responsibilities for data. It's important as well, and we'll talk more about this, to note that the way that we think of data governance at UW-Madison, these are not mutually exclusive areas. There's quite a lot of overlap, and in many cases, and often I'd say it's the normal case, there's joint responsibility that spans multiple domains and multiple steward areas. The addition of the teaching and learning domain came about in 2018, and we also think, although we're interested in your experiences as well, that this is a relatively atypical approach to data governance. We're not aware of others that have formalized teaching and learning as part of their data governance program. Next slide. So what is teaching and learning data? Again, the domains that we've defined, they have a qualitative approach to determining where they sit within the framework. We're not, and the way of thinking about that is that we're moving away from kind of the legacy way of doing governance, which was very much grounded in where the IT systems on campus operated, which departments are the system owners, and there was either formal or de facto data governance that kind of flowed out of that. This is a little different, and it's really looking at data in terms of the characteristics of the data itself, and is not limited to what's in a particular IT system. The data domains do and can, as I mentioned, overlap, and when that occurs, there are multiple stewards that have the joint authority. And then within domains, there are often sub areas that are broken down with different steward areas of focus. In teaching and learning, actually, we have 3 data stewards and 4 areas. We have the broad overall teaching and learning data, but we've also got sub areas for advising, assessment, and career services with professionals who are situated in those areas that work closely on that. And within our domain, the criteria to be considered teaching and learning data is up on the slide, and I'll let you look at that as well. Like the overall institutional data definition, this too is quite broad and is intended to cover a lot of ground. I'll also note that, again, although our teaching and learning domain is formally distinct from one of the other key domains, the student record domain, which is housed within our office of our registrar, that's a relationship that we have a very close working partnership with. And in most of the cases where we're working with teaching and learning data, we're working jointly with our partners and the registrar, and there's really joint authority. And we've worked quite hard to build a strong partnership, strong trust between those units. And I think really that's been an area of success, and would view that as something to definitely emphasize in this kind of model would be not to approach it from a sort of territorial mindset. Next slide. So part of our approach to data governance is looking at documenting and inventorying and ultimately classifying data according to a certain schema. Data classifications give us some tools for managing access to data in an appropriate way without doing it at the extremely granular level when that's not appropriate. At UW-Madison, we have for quite a long time, we've had this 4-fold classification schema ranging from public data all the way up to restricted, the highest, most restrictive classification. And as part of our new approach to institutional data governance, each of the steward areas has established and published standard criteria that we use as our tools for determining which of the classification levels applies. And what drives them is going to vary in each case. Certainly in teaching and learning, and also in the student record areas, a lot of what we're dealing with is built on FERPA compliance or Wisconsin statutes. The whole concept of classifying data is really grounded in a concept of risk management, and certainly that's a part of what we're trying to do as well with data governance. But something that's a little new with our new policy is also establishing the category of protected data, which covers all of the 3 non-public classifications. And our policy is really clarifying in many ways that just because data is not at the restricted level does not mean that it doesn't need to be managed. And in fact, one of the requirements is that any of the protected data classifications need to be managed and authorized throughout their entire life cycle. Next slide. So we wanted to take a few minutes to pause here and open up for discussion. We're interested in hearing from you about how are you governing data at your institution in the teaching and learning area? Do you know if you are? What would be your approach? Who would you contact if you had questions about teaching and learning data or really other kinds of data at your institution? Feel free to chat or grab a microphone.
This is Marcia Ham. I'm from The Ohio State University, and I don't know that I have an answer to that particular question, but I have a question for you. Can you go through some of the details of how you went about the cultural change in implementing this? I mean, laying out a strategic plan. I have so many iterations of strategic planning around learning analytics and how to some ideas for doing this, but I feel like until we address the cultural shift that needs to happen, that plan is just going to kind of sit on a shelf. So if you could maybe walk through some of what you guys did.
Yeah, and certainly we've got, and Kari's going to speak quite a bit about cultural change in the next part of the presentation. I'll address, I think, a part of that, which is also still, I think, frankly, a work in progress, but the adoption of our institutional data policy, which really went into effect right around the time I came into this position. So I didn't have a direct hand in in ushering it in, but I think from what I've observed and what I know of its history, certainly there's a lot of, I mean, if you go back to some of the slides that Chad had shown earlier about our journey through time, this is not something that we came out of the gate in 2018 and said, we've got a policy now. There's been a lot of sort of institutional maturation conversations. And I think building buy-in steadily, I think there's been a general, I think, emphasis on not shaking up our institutional culture, which is decentralized. And so we haven't viewed the institutional data policy as now we're establishing central control over data. Really, and this may vary on your institutional culture, but I think part of one of the success factors in getting our policy off the ground was in formalizing that kind of distributed role and function in sort of building data governance into the domain areas. That said, I think, again, even just thinking about where we are now that the policy is in effect, having a phased implementation schedule is an important piece of that. It's allowed us to sort of stage how we look at it, shake out some of the thorny questions around it on a smaller scale at first, and I think give us the ability to sort of ramp it up in a way that's appropriate and can be accompanied with a lot of conversations and awareness building.
Thanks.
Other questions and comments? And again, we'll have more on cultural change too in the presentation.
Yeah, Dan, I think in the interest of time, to leave more time for questions at the end, you should just proceed.
Great, thanks, Chad. So next slide, Kari. So in the context of our institutional data policy, one of the things that we also think is helpful, and that's part of the institutional philosophy, is that in order to avoid sort of wandering off the map, it's helpful to have a navigator. And in our model, we have the role of our institutional data stewards who can play that role. Our policy requires data to be responsibly managed throughout the entire life cycle. Data stewards provide guidance and consultation, help to apply and interpret the policy, and really help assure that institutional data are identified and documented, appropriately classified, and that access to protected data is managed appropriately. In teaching and learning, in the teaching and learning area, one of the core considerations we have is FERPA, the federal privacy, student privacy law. FERPA prohibits disclosure of personally identifiable information from student education records without student consent, except in certain defined circumstances. Learning analytics is one of those areas where data governance in particular has been closely focused. Chad mentioned earlier, UW-Madison has an institutional definition of learning analytics and has established guiding principles for appropriate use of learning analytics data. That's been helpful too. Learning analytics as a term means different things to different people, and our definition has been part of trying to make sure we're using some common terminology when we speak about it. Use of personally identifiable student activity data for academic research for publication is generally not permissible when it's identifiable data. However, if data are properly de-identified, they can be released for that purpose. We have, in addition to sort of what we think of as learning analytics proper, which we think of as part of the institutional and instructional improvement, we're also working towards and interested in supporting the objectives of academic researchers, education researchers who aren't working specifically on UW-Madison program improvement. And we've done some preliminary work, and we're also building out processes to develop and facilitate access to de-identified student activity data from our digital learning ecosystem, including tools like the Canvas learning management system, and to keep those efforts closely aligned with our campus data governance. Next slide. As our formal data governance has been phased in, starting with new systems and new use cases, and we've had several occasions to sort of apply data governance in the context of learning analytics initiatives as we've launched them, and we have worked closely. The folks leading the learning analytics projects have worked closely with me and others in the data governance space to deal with alignment and authorization, including things like due diligence, documenting the appropriateness of a business purpose, understanding the access management, who has access to the data, who should have access to the data. There's a couple of examples that we've got up on the slide here. We've got learning analytics dashboard tools, one that we've referred to as LEAD, the Learner Engagement Analytics Dashboard, as well as tools for advisors. And again, de-identified data sets for the use of educational research. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kari, who's going to speak more about cultural change.
All right, thank you, Dan. Howdy all, I'm Kari Jordahl. And yes, this is kind of a space where I spend a lot of time. Just a reminder that it's just so important to keep in mind that it is such a complicated process. And Marcia, it was great that you brought that up. So just wanted to reiterate that. I don't have a cool visualization, so I just threw the pirate ship in because I could. But there is like, I think 4 big buckets. I probably should have found some buckets, some clam digging buckets or lobster buckets or something. But it's really around communications. What do we do in terms of community events and programming? How are we engaging with our stakeholders or potential stakeholders, and then kind of some ongoing outreach and training. So I'm going to talk just a little bit and give an example about each of these. The work that we do. So some examples, we have a syllabus statement that's in our syllabus template around being transparent with students around the use of learning analytics. And so instructors can always include that little statement, just basically informing students that that they may be using learning analytics. And then we actually have a web page, a website for it's all about student data transparency that we ask instructors to point their students to. It provides some good foundational information. It links out to also more. And we have gathered some frequently asked questions from students and have some answers to those as well. So that's a really kind of nice one-stop shop to point students to. We do ongoing regular communications, newsletters. We also have a Microsoft Teams site where we post a lot of events and announcements. So just trying to get the word out and talk to people kind of where they are and communicate in a lot of different venues. I am going to just take a minute to talk about our guiding principles, because that has been a huge communications piece. It's a huge cultural change piece. And we basically bring up our guiding principles at everything that we do. So just really wanted to make sure that folks know that learning analytics is not a tool. And when we use analytics, we should always make sure that there is a real unique and holistic person behind all that data. So we communicate our guiding principles at every event, every workshop, every presentation we do. So just basically that foundational piece that students are unique and holistic people. And then there's 4 kind of major principles, and we have a lot more detail in our documentation along with the examples. But We should always use learning analytics to benefit students, minimize any potential adverse impacts, be transparent about how we use them, and respect students' privacy and confidentiality. So that is an ongoing communication and cultural change effort. Another area that I want to mention is just some examples of some community events and programming. And that has changed, of course, with the pandemic and life after, or whatever we're in now. But we do have a pretty active learning analytics community practice. We have in past years had learning analytics speakers that were scheduled. And we've also done semester-long faculty engagement kind of fellowship programs. So our learning analytics community practice, I've just thrown a list of the topics that we've discussed this year. So we just focus on a topic. We'll sometimes invite people that we know might be interested in sharing in that area. And it's just a nice informal way for colleagues to learn from each other and to share maybe what they're doing or questions that they have. I included just a few questions on the slide. Those came out of one of our semester-long fellowships with instructors. Just really, it was an opportunity for us in those programs to just engage deeply with instructors and to really get to hear from them some of the questions that they had. So they built actually a really nice resource that's questions that instructors often have, and we use that to inform our thinking. So just really having a lot of ways where we can kind of go back and forth with our stakeholders. Another aspect of the work that we do is really around the engaging with our stakeholders. So we have built a couple of tools. We have one that's enterprise-wide now, our instructor dashboard, and then we piloted our advisor dashboard. But right now we're actually engaging with students. For all of these audiences that we've engaged with, we go through this participatory design process, really starting out again with that needs. What do they need? What do they want? What type of data might help answer questions they have? And then kind of design around that. So the cycle on the slide just kind of gives an example of the steps that we go through. And it's a typical, I guess, development process, but just really, I guess, also centering our cultural change model in the middle of that. So we have a little ice cream icon on this slide because we actually just finished a couple weeks of engaging with students at our student unions, and we I'm not going to say bribe, we incentivize them to talk to us for about 5 or 7 minutes by offering a coupon for a free ice cream cone. And we talked to them about what did they want for learning analytics, what types of data might be helpful for them. And we actually showed them some screenshots of other institutions. So really excited to be able to engage with that audience. And we don't have any results yet, but we're looking forward to that too. So, and also, yeah, just piloting the tools that we do get to pilot. This one is really supposed to be around training and ongoing outreach. I guess I didn't get that center bubble right, but we do offer regular workshops for tools. And we also do consultations around learning analytics if folks are interested in meeting with us, if they have a more custom need, or if they just want to sit down and talk to us and find out what we can help them with. And we connect with a lot of other groups on campus too. So just trying to be kind of where instructors and be where folks are so that we can be kind of in the conversations and just really hear from them and learn from them. So those are some examples of some of the things that we do. So we'd really be interested in hearing from you folks, like where are you again in your journey and what are you doing with cultural change efforts? And also just open it up to any other questions you might have.
There's one question from Karen earlier. Maybe I could speak to that briefly too. The question was, how do you guide from the institutional level, the grassroots stakeholders to collect and appropriately use data? I think there's no silver bullet to that. From my standpoint, it really all starts with awareness. And I think it's going to be a sort of a long ongoing process. But there are pieces of it like building individual awareness, but also building out our processes for enterprise tools and tool intake that are aware of governance, and help us to move it out of having people. Frankly, we want to get to the point where awareness is just sort of a foundational piece, but what works is really baked into the way that we bring things into our campus, into our ecosystem.
Yeah, I guess, thanks, Dan. I guess I just want to comment to something that Marcia also posted. Stakeholders don't know how to answer what they need, right? And we know that. So we actually tried to do some student engagement last spring semester. And when we asked students, hey, what would be helpful for you? They didn't know what we were talking about. So we got some good data around how they felt about their data being used and about privacy, but we didn't get a lot of tool specific stuff. So by showing these students in the past few weeks some specific concrete examples, like this tool, what does this tool tell you? Does this look like something that might be helpful for you? It generated a lot of different types of thinking. So yes, folks don't necessarily know. It's a really good comment.
All right, I have another question pertaining to students. Do you guys have a student-facing dashboard? Forgive me if I missed that part of the presentation. Do you have a student-facing dashboard?
We do not.
Okay.
Not yet.
Well, yeah. We're hoping that this engagement this semester will help us choose something, an approach or a tool or something that we can pilot with them. And Kim's telling you to stop asking hard questions.
I know she is. I've had a lot of caffeine, so the brain's working out. So I was just wondering, transparency of how data is being collected, is being shared out. So I just think when we start thinking about student-facing dashboards, what the concept is for educating students on that data literacy piece. Like when they look at the data, when they look at that dashboard, what does it tell them, and how do they not get wrapped up in assumptions about themselves, or kind of go down the dark side of misinterpreting what they're seeing.
Yeah, that's really important. I at least was pleasantly surprised in all the face-to-face interactions that I had that students read. We gave them 8 different visualizations and they pretty much got them. I mean, they sometimes struggled with some, like they wouldn't notice a filter that actually had some really nice functionality. And some of them, it's like, I'm not sure. And then if we waited like 10 or 15 seconds, they're like, oh, I think this is telling me this, but they really were pretty good at figuring it out.
Yep.
And they were also really good at saying, I don't like this one. This one would make this. So, other students might like it, but this one wouldn't work for me. I wouldn't look at it. So we did get some feedback like that, and I think it will be informative.
Also, along those lines, we recently surveyed students with multiple questions, and one of them was how often they wanted to be reminded of what our policies are. And 3/4 of the student respondents said at least the beginning of every academic year, and many of them wanted every academic term. So finding some way to communicate and share what is law and what is policy at the university will be key for us moving forward.
Yes.
Oh, Kari's asking me about the parrot on my shoulder.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
It's Cocorito.
Yeah,
that's very important for the presentation.
Absolutely. All right, I think we are at time. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciated the conversation. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have other questions. I would be happy to talk to you and find out more about what you're doing at your institutions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.